Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's Schriever Spacepower Series. I'm Charles Galbraith, Senior Resident Fellow at the Mitchell Institute's Space Power Advantage Center of Excellence. In today's rapidly evolving strategic environment, space-based communications and positioning, navigation, and timing systems form the backbone of our national security architecture. These capabilities enable everything from precision strike to nuclear command and control. As competitors continue to develop increasingly sophisticated counterspace capabilities, our military space systems face unprecedented challenges. The Space Force is responding through modernization efforts, commercial partnerships, and innovative acquisition approaches. Today, I'm honored to welcome a leader who is at the forefront of these efforts. Mr. Cordell DeLaPena serves as the Program Executive Officer for Military Communications, Positioning, Navigation, and Timing at Space Systems Command. In this role, he manages and oversees the development, production, delivery, and maintenance of critical communications and PNT systems worth more than $22 billion. With decades of experience in military acquisition and leadership, Mr. DeLaPena brings unique insights into how the Space Force is ensuring these foundational capabilities remain resilient and effective in contested environments. With that, Mr. DeLaPena, welcome to the Schriever Spacepower Series. Before we dive into questions, I'd like to hand it over to you for any opening comments.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. It's really my pleasure to be here at the Mitchell Institute today. I think the timing, Space Force being established in 2019, we are at that crossroads, similar to how Billy Mitchell himself introduced some innovative thinking on how to apply air power. I think all those concepts apply today when we think about innovative thinking and new capabilities for space power. Since Space Force got established in 2019 with the focus of protecting our nation's interest in space, defending against counterspace threats, continuing to operate to deliver global capability, in my portfolio, Satcom and PNT, we have started that pivot to disaggregate our capabilities to make it thicker, more resilient, in accordance with our force designs by the Space Warfare Analysis Center. As the PEO, I'll share with you, since 2019, I'm the longest tenured PEO at SSC. We have completed programs, started new work, and we're ready to make that pivot. We launched the final AHF, Satellite 6, back in 2020, and on the PNT side, we've launched 7 of the 10 GPS-3s.
Wow.
I'll talk a little bit later about bringing OCX and MGUE, how that's all going to converge. But we are strategically ready to make the pivot into new capabilities, and I look forward to the discussion today.
That's excellent, and congratulations on being the longest tenured PEO.
Oh, you're welcome, thank you.
Staying power is an important thing in leadership, especially for the continuity of programs that sometimes take years to develop and field. So congratulations, thank you again.
Thanks, Charles.
So let's dive in and talk about PNT, and in particular GPS, because it's one of those standard systems that I think many people just assume it's always going to be there. But as we've seen, there's some threats to GPS through jamming and other systems. But can you give us a snapshot of where we are with the GPS architecture? How healthy is it? And this can include the space-based element as well as the ground segment.
So I'll cover all three.
Okay.
So in this portfolio, I'm also responsible for the sustainment contracts for the on-orbit assets. There's a handful of metrics that we monitor for the on-orbit performance. So it's coverage, accuracy, integrity, continuity, and availability. We're the best in the world at providing that end-to-end capability. Over the past year, for example, our user range error for accuracy, the average has been 29.8 centimeters. That's 11.7 inches. That's on average. And at its peak, at its best, it's 24.5 centimeters or 9.6 inches. Wow. US GPS, other countries have GPS. Europe, Russia, Japan, they have global constellation, Japan, China.
Yeah.
Japan has a regional capability,
yes.
South Korea has a regional capability. Of all those on-orbit systems, there's only one that's certified for worldwide safety of flight by the FAA, and that's US GPS. That's because of our high performance against those metrics. And the world can thank it's the Integrated Mission Delta, it's IMD 31, the men and women under Colonel Andy Menchner, who operate that system day in and day out, the world can thank them for that high level of performance. But in my portfolio, we also are responsible for the modernization of PNT. That entire architecture is really focused now on meeting the anti-jam and spoofing threat. So with the launch of GPS-3 SV5, that brought the total on-orbit constellation to the 24 required with that M-code anti-jam capability. We've launched 6, 7, and we're about to launch 8
Wow. Okay.
at the end of May. So we have sufficient on-orbit capacity for anti-jam. Second lane in the road is the ground. There's a program called Next Generation Operational Command Control System. It's known as OCX.
Yes.
Tough program. Tough program. I've been in this business a while, like you said. I've been assigned to work some tough programs. At one point in my career, I was the Air Force Jitters SPO director.
Okay.
At one point in my career, I was the Fab T SPO director. For those of you in our business know, those are tough programs. OCX is the hardest I've ever worked.
Wow.
All I can tell you is that being the PEO on that program, watching it for 5 years, we're bringing it to a close. Raytheon, the prime contractor, is scheduled to submit their DD-250 within the next 30 days, which will allow government testing and operational testing. And I will certify, the PEO will certify, ready to transition to operations by the end of the calendar year.
That's a huge milestone.
Huge milestone. And the first major element of risk reduction is getting that DD-250 submitted and getting through this FCA, PCA audits. Which leads us in the third lane on the road, which is the user equipment.
Yeah.
So there's a program called Military GPS Users Equipment Increment 1. It had 3 variants. It had a terrestrial variant, a maritime variant, and an aviation variant. As the PO, I've certified the land variant through testing on a Joint Light Tactical Vehicle and an Army Stryker. For the maritime variant, it's testing with the DDG, the destroyer, Navy Destroyer Laboratory. And the airborne variant, we're flight testing with an Army UAV. We're taking it to the jamming range next week.
Wow.
We'll fly it against the jammers, and we're scheduled to certify the final variant of MGU Increment 1 in July of 2025. So that will bring all 3 of those lanes in the road, the legs of the stool, all converge in 2025, enable the warfighter to start depending and training with anti-jam, both US GPS and with our coalition partners.
Because of the M code available with GPS-3, is that right? Or is there another level of anti-jam within the system that you're describing?
So GPS-3, those 10 space vehicles, they've all been built, and we'll launch all 10 of them. We've launched 7 in the fall. We'll launch 8, 9, and 10 over the next year and a half. We also have on contract the next generation, which is the next era of anti-jam.
Right.
Higher power, tighter beam. It's called RMP, which stands for Regional Military Protection. And because GPS is occurring in L-band, optimized for that geo orbit, we counter jamming by concentrating our power, and we blast our way through it.
Okay.
That's the current anti-jam capability. Makes it very, very hard for our adversary to go against that power, because they'd have to build enormous jammers that are vulnerable in other areas as well.
Okay.
So that is our current path for anti-jam. And then we're also pursuing other alternatives for non-space, other phenomenologies for a true PNT blended solution.
Okay. We'll come back to that here in a little bit, but thank you for that rundown on GPS. Sure. But that is only half of your portfolio. Satcom is the other half. And I know that advanced extremely high frequency, or AEHF system, WGS, enhanced polar system, these are all within your portfolio, as well as the legacy maintenance of Milstar and Discus 3, right? So can you give us a snapshot of where we are with the health of our Satcom from a military perspective?
Sure. So in the Mil-Satcom mission area, that's where we have really initiated this pivot to disaggregation.
Okay.
You probably recall General Hayden.
Oh, yeah.
Used to use this term, high value, juicy target.
Yep.
So when the cost of launch was a constraint, because the cost of launch has gone down considerably in 10 years, especially since companies like SpaceX, for example, have implemented this recoverable booster architecture. So the cost of launch is now not the constraint it was when it was really expensive. We would put as much mass on a rocket, multi-mission, and that's what General Hyten called the high-value juicy target.
Right.
In my portfolio, we're working to disaggregate that. So the previous aggregated, which was AHF, supported both the strategic and tactical users. In this mission area, we have started the disaggregation into a strategic lane in the road and a tactical lane in the road. We have currently, in the Satcom mission area, 4 major source selections, all ongoing.
Wow.
It's ESS for the follow-on strategic, and then we've got 3 major protected tactical waveform, which is the tactical. We're just implementing a tactical waveform phenomenology, a frequency hopping protected tactical waveform, which we will implement in a commercial variant.
Okay.
We're going to implement it through our ground processing station on WGS. We have a very, very commercial-like capability called PTSG for Protected Tactical Satcom Geo.
Okay.
And our final is a Protected Tactical Satcom Regional for the high-end jamming environment, which includes aspects similar to AHF of on-orbit, on-satellite knowing. All those programs are in some phase of a source selection as we speak. And the narrowband is a follow-on for the MUAS program, but that's the program that transitioned from the Navy into the Space Force. It was the first major acquisition. And we released that RFP 2 weeks ago, and that program is also in source selection. So we have moved out considerably in new work in the Satcom mission area.
That's great. So when people think about disaggregation, I think they often associate that with the proliferation that we're seeing from the Space Development Agency in their proliferated warfighting space architecture. But that's a separate type of resilience measure, just by disaggregating so that you don't have all of those mission sets on one platform.
That's correct.
You now have them on maybe 4, but not necessarily 400. That in itself creates a level of resilience.
That's correct. And it also enables an opportunity to design and develop lower risk, lower cost capabilities. And so if we're not concerned about the price of a launch, then we're not going to design these next generation satellites, for example, to have 15-year design lives, triple redundancy, packed full of secondary and tertiary emissions. That's the kind of disaggregation you'll see, which is why we have a layered approach for Satcom. And when we start to put that level of thinking into PNT, we'll leverage our GPS prototyping program as the starting point to start that disaggregation in PNT as well.
Okay, excellent. You might have hit on this in your other comments about the 4 different source selections ongoing, but nuclear command and control and communications is probably one of the most stressing mission sets for the Space Force. And we've got to make sure we get it right 100% of the time. So programs like the Evolved Strategic Satcom will replace the AEHF constellation with additional capabilities. And I think you talked about this through higher power, but what other ways are we looking at ensuring that we can assure those critical signals for nuclear command and control get through jamming environments or any other sort of contested environments we might experience?
So that is the challenge of the nuclear command and control, the NC3 enterprise. It's designed for the absolute, in my portfolio, in my experience working in space programs, it is the absolutely most severe environment for space-based communications. It's hardened, it's survivable. So on the very worst day, in the very worst environment, electronics that's not hardened or designed to be survivable with that high mission assurance become inoperable in that environment. High electromagnetic pulse.
Right.
If you aren't designed to withstand that, then all those other systems will be unavailable. So for ESS, we've disaggregated the strategic and the tactical, still backward compatible with all of the NC3 terminals, programs like FAB-T, which are now in production. And the services are still fielding those FABT and all its variants. So it has to be backward compatible, still hardened, still survivable, with other aspects of continuity. All those things are in place, and that's a source selection that will field that capability to ensure there's no break in service, given the fact that we launched the last AHF about 5 years ago.
Okay, excellent. So you also mentioned some commercial capabilities when you were discussing waveforms and frequency hopping and commercial solutions. SSC has been talking about exploit what we have, buy what we can, and build only what we must to integrate commercial into the overall architecture. So given that some requirements, like the nuclear command and control, will be unique.
Always
right,
unique.
Right? How do you, as the PEO, work to manage the combination of both commercial as well as unique military requirements into your overall architecture?
So I think General Gutline's depiction of exploit, buy, build, that is the mantra for every PEO in the Space Force.
Okay.
And we have to. We are going to leverage the global commercial investment as well as the global international investment in space. I know we all track the budget for space globally. I think the latest metrics that you can pull off the internet indicate that in 2024, the total global investment was around $600 billion, and they expect that to get close to like $1.5 to $2 trillion in the next 10 years.
Yep. Yep.
Of that global investment, the Space Force's budget in 2025 was $29 billion. Right, so we're not even 5% of that big equation. There's a heavy investment going on out there globally. We want to leverage, we want to exploit it, we want to buy it, and save our precious Space Force RDT&E money for those tough programs that are military unique. Things like NC3, scintillation, or things like really, really hard AntiJam.
Right.
So that's our approach. In terms of how we are exploiting the international business, for example, this summer we launched a hosted payload. It's the global Satcom payload for over-the-pole communications.
Okay.
And we hosted that payload. It's the EPSR recapitalization program. We hosted that on a Space Norway commercial space vehicle.
Right.
We're doing something similar with Satcom, in which we're working with Space Luxembourg to host that PTS AntiJam payload on their commercial vehicle. So we're leveraging investments in commercial. We're doing that across the board. So whenever we can exploit existing capability or buy services, buy bandwidth from companies like Starlink, and just save our developments for the true military purposes, that's how we're going to leverage all that investment globally into the Space Force.
Excellent. So you and I have been around the space acquisition community a while.
Right.
I won't go back to how many years, but you've served in multiple space acquisition organizations, and we've seen the transition from SMC,
Sure.
Space and Missile Systems Center, to SMC 2.0, and now Space Systems Command. We've seen some great successes, and we've seen some misses as well. What about the current approach of Space Systems Command gives you confidence that we're on the right path?
Sure. There are two things I really like about our recent evolution from Space and Missile Systems Center to SMC 2.0 to Space Systems Command. First is the disaggregation of program execution, decision making.
Yep.
You recall,
Oh yeah.
when you and I worked programs together, we had one PEO, and I'm a PEO. I've got 9 ACAT-1 programs, 22 ACAT programs and initiatives altogether. I'm one PEO. You multiply that by 5. It is a tremendous amount of work, and it was challenging for one PEO to keep up with all of it. I think a great decision was to disaggregate the decision making to the lowest possible point of execution. We went from one PEO to today, now we have 6 PEOs. And I got a comment on the quality of the Space Force PEO. So I'm the long in tooth PEO, been around for 6 years, but our PEOs are just absolutely top notch. I've either been a PEO or worked directly for a PEO in the last 13 years of my career. And our Space Force PEOs, they constantly have to fight out of their weight class.
Right.
they are given tremendous responsibility, and with their energy and their innovative thinking and their passion, I am thoroughly impressed with our PEOs, and I think going from 1 to 6 was the absolutely right thing to do. The second thing I'm really a big fan of is the stand-up under General Saltzman of the integrated mission delta. So in our mission area, which was PNT, we were one of the first pilot programs for the integrated mission delta and the corresponding system delta. With the upcoming transition to in PNT, that OCX program,
Right.
I think we found the sweet spot. I think it's a best practice where Colonel Andy Menchner was the program manager in the Air Force Space Force. He is the senior material leader
Right.
for the ACAT-1 OCX program, but he's dual-hatted as the commander of operations for 2 subs, which is the day-to-day operation of the PNT operations.
Right.
And he had to balance resources to enable continued mission in a wartime environment, as well as in parallel, meet his acquisition responsibilities to field that new system. And I told Andy, you got to make those priorities, and I will back you up on any decision you make. And it has been just a new paradigm, which has enabled the right prioritization of operational resources and development resources, the most effective and efficient use I've seen in my career. So I think that is a great example of how we should do that IMD in the future.
That's excellent. So the PEOs, we're going to have General Panzenhagen, the Assured Access to Space PEO, with us next week.
That's excellent.
But when you're talking about hitting above their weight class, I think it's really important for the audience to remember that these PEOs, for the most part, you're an SCS, General Panzenhagen's a Brigadier General, but the others are colonels and an NH4. So these are leaders who are obviously hitting way above their weight class, because on another service, these PEOs would be 2 stars in many cases.
So that's a fair observation. Very, very gifted, all of them. Handpicked. And I think the Space Force does a great job of growing their young talent and getting them ready for the next phase. And these PEOs are no different.
Right.
And our PEOs, we have 2 civilian PEOs, we got the 4 military PEOs, and I think making sure that we have civilian PEOs as well for that progression of our civilian workforce is also important.
Right. Absolutely. It's not just the officers. There's officers, civilians, and enlisted that the Space Force is constantly working to develop and make sure that they're the best in the world.
That's correct. Yeah.
And so far, I think they're doing a good job of it.
Yeah. So, I couldn't agree more.
Right. So let's talk about the budget environment a little bit, because you talked about the various PEOs, and that you really can't do your job unless you've got assured resources and funding to make these programs a reality. And yet we are in one of the most contentious, dynamic, however you want to describe it, situations when it comes to the budget. We're in a year-long CR. There was an 8% drill, or there is an 8% drill across the DoD, which is to be expected with any sort of new administration that transition. But there's also a reconciliation to the tune of $150 billion, and there's building of the 26 budget and building of the 27 POM. There's a lot going on from a budget perspective. So how do you and your the other PEOs within Space Systems Command and across the Space Force work to make sure that you can continue to deliver capabilities, and are you seeing any impacts as a result of all this turmoil from a budget perspective?
Yeah, so the key, Charles, is through all that parallel activity, we have not been given relief on executing our current programs of record and filling the kind of combat capability we just talked about. So the first is we got to prioritize today's execution, today's program execution, and make sure we continue to keep those programs on track. A major challenge, though, is the uncertainty of the budget. So a CR prevents the start of new work, which is probably the biggest impact for us. Given the fact that the Space Force got stood up to get after emerging threats, execute quickly, the CR, one of the limitations is, until the new budget is approved,
right.
The establishment of new like PEs, new program elements, all those get put on hold. The one thing that the Congress did give us, which is a new authority in 2024, was something called the Quick Start Authority. Mm-hmm. That says even under a CR, if the Department of Defense and the services identify initiatives that are so important that they can't wait for the budget,
Right.
that it authorized the DoD to start new work up to $100 million. In 2024, we started a program called Resilient GPS as a result of the Defense Science Board and Space Warfare Analysis Center start this disaggregation and thickening of the PNT enterprise. We started that program under a new start. We carved out $40 million of existing 24 funds, got the Secretary of the Air Force, DepSecDef to approve that, notified the Hill, and we started that in 2024. That's one thing I think is a good thing. And I would like to see that authority actually grow to a number higher than $100 million so that all the service could actually start new work. And then in parallel, we have to continue to support all of the what-if drills that are coming down everything's in parallel. But from my perspective, what I tell my workforce is like, we're in this bow wave. And with the new administration, with new requirements, who understandably, a new administration wants to prioritize the first budget based on those priorities. And once we get past this first phase, once we get a 26 and 27 input, things will get stable for at least a couple of cycles. And then we're not going to have this debate of all this parallel activity, which should or shouldn't be funded.
Okay. And the Space Force is still a very small service, and so that's a lot of work for a small group of folks to constantly do and deal with. So my hat's off to you.
Yeah, so it's going to be really, really important that we prioritize our work, put the talent on that prioritized list of work, but at the same time, we're also exploring other acquisition approaches to lower the risk and lower the amount of oversight. So traditionally, these ACAT-1 programs usually have some degree of risk to make an IOC date that's usually pretty close to us. In order to do that, we acknowledge those risks and we provide enough staff to provide enough oversight. In the future, we're not going to have that luxury because we're not going to be able to either have the staff or the funding to fund that level of risk. So looking at other acquisition approaches to prototype, to burn down risk, to enable fixed price efforts as follow-ons in every single acquisition going forward.
Excellent. Earlier you mentioned working with our international partners.
Sure.
And hosting some payloads. And we know that Europe has Galileo, Japan has QZSS for PNT. So what efforts are being made to sort of integrate those sorts of capabilities? We know that GPS is the gold standard across the globe, but is there a way to integrate those to create a very resilient multi-GNS system?
So as of today, that is the plan. There is a program still in the Space Force's portfolio. It's the follow-on to the military GPS users equipment, Increment 1, and that's Increment 2. What Increment 2 brings is incorporation of other PNT sources. So not only just US GPS, but it'll incorporate some alternate PNT sources that the Army uses. It'll incorporate international GPS, like multi-GPS from space, things like from our allies, incorporating the Europe solution, incorporating like the Japanese solution, and it'll blend those solutions. So in the terminal solutions, that's where you'll see this convergence of the multiple sources. And so you'll see that both in the PNT mission area and the concepts for hybrid Satcom terminals on the Satcom side.
Okay, yeah, very good. You mentioned the quick start for the resilient GPS system, and we know that there's jamming going on in Ukraine as well as in the Middle East, and it's having an impact on civilian users as well. So what approaches is Space Systems Command taking to ensure that we have an assured PNT signal for our military users, but as well as the civil segment out there as well?
So the primary focus today is fielding that AntiJam capability. It's the MECO capability that I talked about earlier, with the follow-on regional military protection, which is the baseline for GPS 3F.
Okay.
That gets us, when you think about operations in proximity to a jammer, think about moving from the outside of a bullseye to the middle of the bullseye, M code and RMP get you almost all the way in there.
Okay.
And that's today's technology. But in the future, we're also looking at other alternatives. In the past 2 years, I have sponsored reverse industry days, both for Satcom and PNT, to look at other alternative solutions. We fund those through the AFWorks SpaceWorks projects. For the PNT side, various different approaches. We got awarded about 19, almost $40 million worth of these new efforts, looking at other alternatives for PNT. And then the RGPS program enables that initial disaggregation and thickening of the PNT enterprise just to make it more resilient.
Okay. Quick question about reverse industry days.
Sure.
So can you help explain what is that? I think an industry day is when industry tells you what they can provide, but a reverse industry day is what you're looking for. Is that right?
So we do both.
Okay.
Recall that once a year, Los Angeles SMC, now SSC, we hold what we say is our industry day. And we tell the industry, this is all the new work coming your way.
Okay.
So every summer, past couple of summers, I talk about these are the new proposals I'm going to release. This is the new work I plan on awarding based on my budget, which we're telling industry, get ready for new work coming your way. A reverse industry day is the opposite, in which we tell industry, these are our challenges. These are the threats we're facing. These are things that our current programs of record currently don't address fully.
Okay.
What new technology, what new approach do you have that we should consider? So we've done both. We've done one in PNT 2 years ago. We did Satcom last year, and I really like using that AFWorks SpaceWorks approach because it's targeted at small businesses who, in the past, don't really have an established relationship with the Space Force. And that's how we get this new think and new thought into our enterprise. So I really like that approach.
Okay, excellent. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for industry to come and say, hey, we've got some new technologies because we've been investing in one area or another. So let's talk a little bit about new technologies. Optical communications, for example, are becoming much more accepted and integrated into operations. We're on the brink of quantum-resistant cyber protection for cyber threats, which are growing out there. So what emerging technologies are exciting you about the Satcom and the PNT mission areas?
Well, you touched on two really important ones. In my experience, when I was the SPO director for the Air Force for airborne data links, what you find is that architectures that are linked are more effective and more efficient. It is more powerful to fight as a network than a non-networked approach.
Of course.
That same solution space, that same level of thinking, that's now being applied to our space assets. Like, what's the equivalent of the data link transfer in space? So to begin with, you got to establish that physical link. In the airborne, that's all line of sight. Mm-hmm. In space, the utilization of crosslinks is something that we are exploring. We're seeing how it's being done on the commercial side. Architectures like Starlink are leveraging that optical ring. We funded our own prototyping effort on GPS, which we're going to do some experimenting and prototyping, how to operate it, how to control it. On one of our PNT satellites that had some additional power weight space available to do it.
Right. So
crosslinks to network, and then the computing to actually handle all that data, both like intermission, within the mission, and then external to the mission. You need a lot of high power processing to do that. So those are two things I think that you got right. Those are things that you'll see in the future Space Force architecture, and it's consistent with how the Space Warfighting Analysis Center has defined the next generation of the space data network. It's a data network.
Okay, so we hit on this earlier. When it comes to assuring the PNT signal to end users, it's not necessarily just GPS. There's multi-orbits that can be factored in here. NTS-3 is going to be demonstrating from GEO, QZSS, the Japanese regional systems, also at GEO. So how are you integrating sort of this multi-orbit or multi-layer approach for PNT?
So today, that integration comes through the terminal.
Okay.
So that MGUE Increment 2 program will converge and merge multiple phenomenologies, and the hybrid Satcom terminal concepts will do something that's very similar on the Satcom side. So it's like, can you dial the right waveform depending on what's available? And you'll see it's the terminal solutions which will bring that convergence to the architecture.
Okay, excellent. So we've talked a lot about the delivery of capabilities and ground systems, and you touched on this earlier in your opening comments about the end user equipment as well. Really, at the end of the day, that's where the rubber meets the road, right, is with the warfighter. So what efforts are currently underway on the Satcom and PNT to deliver those effective capabilities to the warfighter? You talked about some operational testing with the maritime, airborne, and ground elements. But can you give us some more examples of how you're working to integrate Satcom and PNT into the hands of warfighters at combatant commands, in particular into PACOM?
So from my portfolio, and I'll use the PNT example, that M code, that's a new waveform. When we field RMP, like that's a new waveform phenomenology. So we'll work very, very closely with the terminal developer, regardless of service.
Okay. Yeah.
To make sure that all those new phenomenologies, we can actually close the link from space. But from my experience working programs like Air Force Jitters, working programs like FAB-T, it's the integration into the entire infrastructure, all the fleets, all the airplanes, all the ships, all the vehicles, all the handhelds. It's got to be integrated. I think the current approach to develop and modernize these software-defined radios, these software-defined terminals, in which the antenna receiver is a digital solution, that's going to enable, on the platform integration side, a much quicker integration as opposed to every single time there's like a new waveform that requires a custom integration. Mm-hmm. Those software-defined terminals in the future, which from my perspective, we work very closely with all the services program offices doing that level of modernization, is that will enable that faster fielding of capability and that end-to-end from space.
Yeah, software reprogrammability to increase the flexibility and response options to emerging threats.
That's correct.
It sounds like a different take on dynamic space operations, rather than just maneuver, but it's maybe frequency hopping or changing your program system.
Yeah, diversity of phenomenology, flexibility for speed of integration. I mean, those are two key tenets of building any new architecture.
Excellent. So we've talked about some threats, jamming. We talked a little bit about cyber. The threat environment seems to be just changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and we see China fielding systems left and right. So how are you adjusting the acquisition approach? You talked about this through disaggregation a little bit, but are there other efforts that you're seeing from the Satcom and PNT portfolios to operate through contested environments, whether they be a nuclear environment or just a heavy jamming environment?
So I'm a big believer of the layered defense approach.
Okay.
It's very similar to how we protect high value assets in the air or high value assets at sea. That first step is that disaggregation. More targets, more variability as opposed to one target, no variability. The Space Force, since we got established, a lot of major efforts in the protect and defend mission on orbit. And then within the system itself, what are the things that you can do to just increase your own resiliency? But from an acquisition perspective as a PEO, I think it's important to recognize what you just described, Charles, is that the adversary gets a vote on the fielding and the speed at which those threats are going to evolve. And what I'd like to see is this continued development and continued prototyping. No longer have 15-year design lives that just lock us in. Right. We should always be prototyping, always be fielding. I mean, very similar to the tranche approach for capability. Just building block upon building block so we're ready for any emerging threat.
Oh, excellent. So I've got one last question
Please.
For you, and it's about PNT and GPS, because I think GPS has become so ubiquitous that many people conflate PNT with GPS. And the fact is there are other solutions out there. We talked about some of the other space-based systems. But from the PEO for PNT perspective, how are you working with other airborne or land-based or other forms of navigation and positioning to ensure that the end user has what they absolutely need, even if the space layer, for example, became unavailable.
So from my perspective, what ties that together for space-based GPS is the synchronized timing of the entire constellation with all of the receivers that it's in contact with. Timing is critical.
Timing, yep.
So there's other forms to navigate. You know, there's the INS, inertial navigation. You look at the concepts of digital mapping of the world. But in order to get the true position, those receivers need to have a element of time. And that's what GPS provides. Those receivers at any given instant have visibility to 3 to 4 different satellites on orbit. And through Doppler's effect, it calculates a very, very precise location based on time. As a backup, it's like, imagine getting closer and closer to the bullseye on the PNT side. If you need a PNT solution and your distance to the target isn't going to drift very much, maybe another solution will be okay. But until that time comes, you're still very dependent on space-based GPS. So as a backup, I think all those things are worth looking into. Other phenomenologies. You know, we've talked to companies who want to bring back the automated navigator.
Okay.
That does the automated sextant shot looking at the stars.
Wow.
All great concepts based on ConOps. But in addition, in parallel, like when I talked about that reverse industry day, one of the initiatives we're pursuing is how do we get better clocks? How do we make the time better? Because that user range error I talked about, the majority of that is just due to the drift in time. Even time in GPS drifts, which is why we need a continuous refresh, which we get from the Naval Observatory, the master time clock. So I think in the future, you'll see blended solutions for that software-defined concept, and then alternatives to how to get time out there for these other phenomenologies. Okay. And that's where I think the heavy thinking needs to occur, and that's where quantum can help us the most.
Excellent. Well, with the importance of timing,
right.
I think it's time for us to transition to some audience questions.
Sounds good.
So for those out there watching us, you know the drill by now. Aidan will call on you, then please unmute your mic and state your name and affiliation before asking your question. You can also submit your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. So with that, Aidan, who do we have first?
First, we have Stephen Clark from Ars Technica.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Hi, can you hear me?
Got you loud and clear.
I can.
Hi, thank you. My question's, Cordell, is about the recent switch of a couple of GPS satellites from ULA over to SpaceX, moving forward those launches forward. You mentioned early on in your presentation about getting the M-code capability fully operational. Is that the motivation for getting these satellites up there, maybe timing that with OCX testing, or what was the motivation for that? Thanks.
Right. So those GPS-3 space vehicles were made available to launch, which means they came off the production line a couple of years ago. And they were put in storage because the Space Force had higher priorities for that launch window. GPS is a relatively healthy constellation. And so putting those 3 in storage did not detract or reduce the amount of PNT capability that we have for the nation. They've been integrated. They're planned to be integrated on a SpaceX Falcon 9. That has proven to be a very reliable launch partner for us. So no concerns with the SpaceX solution at this point. And then when the other launch providers are available, then we'll consider those for the PNT solution as well. But it was really the higher Space Force priorities for those protect and defend missions and the health of the GPS constellation, which allowed us to put those in storage for a couple of years.
Very good. Thank you. Aidan?
Next, we have Frank Wolf from Defense Daily.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my question. I just wondered on the military GPS user equipment, increment 1, the original aviation platform was the B2. The decision was made last fall to switch from the B2 to the Army Gray Eagle. I wondered if you could just sort of outline the original decision to make the B2 as the lead aviation platform and why the decision was made to switch to the Gray Eagle.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we needed to verify the ability to get through the AntiJam environment, calculate the position, verify the accuracy, and we had to do that in an airborne environment. The Gray Eagle does that for us. One of the interesting things about the B2 integration is that it also incorporated a weapons release capability. That's something that we'll pick up in testing at later phases of the integration. But the B2 is a small fleet, and due to the development challenges on both sides, we missed our integration window. And so rather than hold up that verification on the MGU-E program, we partnered with the Army since they had a platform available to us. And we could still meet all those capability requirements verification through that platform, which is why we switched and which is why our SAE agreed with it.
Okay. Next question, please, Aiden.
Next, we have Teresa Hitchens from Breaking the Fence.
Go ahead, Teresa.
Hi there. Thanks for doing
Hi,
this.
Teresa.
I have a question about the recent FCC notice of inquiry on potential new rulemaking to sort of change its spectrum licensing rules to encourage the development of alternatives to GPS, both terrestrial and space-based. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. I know that, the FCC only regulates commercial access to spectrum, but as you know, in the case of Legato, for example, it can have outsized impacts. Their rulings can have outsized impacts on DoD. So I wondered if DoD had weighed in on that or weighed in via NTIA, or if it was something that, you had thoughts about.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that particular FCC issue, but I know that members of my team track all of those frequency requests relative to where we are and where we operate. But the concept of looking at other frequencies and other phenomenologies, those are all things we're pursuing. Because right now, all of our PNT solutions are in L-band. And we're looking at other phenomenologies, like, for example, S-band or something else, to really just provide other sources of PNT other than US GPS and L-band.
So along those lines of alternate methods, I mean, right now, GPS provides a signal out, and it is the PNT signal. But we can embed that sort of capability for navigation in a comm channel as well, or something else. Is that right?
So it's unique to L-band.
Okay.
And it's unique to the MEO orbit.
Okay.
So for the military, that anti-jam waveform, it is optimized to operate under those conditions. And the receivers are tuned to those conditions. But in the future, as we look at different frequencies, for example, and different bands, a software-defined terminal with the ability to adapt back and forth, that's really where the future needs to go.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Aiden, who's up next?
Next, we have Shelly Mesh from Inside Defense.
Go ahead, Shelly.
Hi, thank you for taking some time to talk with us. I wanted to ask about is there a value in maintaining Space Force development and ownership over some of or a majority of Satcom capabilities rather than just acquiring the entirety from a service product like Starshield? What's the right balance between kind of off-the-shelf versus RDT&E programs for Satcom?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. That goes back to the exploit, buy, build approach for space capabilities. From the Space Force perspective, from my perspective as the PEO for MilSatcom, for example, we really want to focus our limited, precious RDT&E funding and focus them on our hardest military challenges. Things like that NC3, the nuclear environment, or really robust AntiJam, like an Indo-PACOM environment. And where we can, either buy commercial from a Starlink or an Amazon or a Viasat, buy those capabilities. For example, sailors on the carriers in the middle of the sea, and for them to do their MWR reach back, they don't need the exquisite Satcom solutions. So that's how we're going to prioritize where we invest our funds. We're focusing them on the military unique missions.
So traditionally, satellite communications in particular is an area where we have leveraged extensively commercial. I remember a few years back, a number of about 90% of our satellite communications came from commercial sources. So this is not something new. But your point about if it's for morale, welfare, and well-being, that might be a great commercial solution to get the broadband and have calls back to home. But if that same carrier battle group is now steaming towards a conflict situation through a jammed environment, they need to have more robust communications. And if it's to a submarine and the nuclear fleet, that's got to get through. And so that's where you're going to have your dedicated military unique requirements for dedicated Satcom.
And that's correct. That's absolutely right, Charles. And I think in the future, you'll see a similar thought process for PNT.
Okay.
Because we are talking to commercial companies who see there is no commercial source for PNT at this point.
Right.
And so if it's not in a high-end, high jamming environment, those are opportunities for the Space Force and the other services to exploit and buy. And we will develop against those high-end threats.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Aiden, I think we have time for a couple more questions.
We have an anonymous question written in. The Commercial Space Office discussed last year the idea of having maneuverable GEO as a pool of vendors. Mr. DeLaPena, how do you see maneuverable GEO Satcom fitting into the overall MIL-SATCOM architecture?
So maneuver in general for space is an option that we're looking at in terms of resiliency. But they have to be designed from the start for that type of movements, because in space, that means you got to carry a lifetime's worth of fuel with you, because there's no gas station in space as of today. So there's other infrastructure that's associated with that. But being able to maneuver assets, especially at GEO, to areas of the world in which perhaps there's a higher priority or there's a higher threat, those are all options I think the Space Force is pursuing. And it's no different than warfighting in the other domains. I mean, the fundamental concept for warfighting, for those of you who went to the war colleges, is that you have to outmaneuver your enemy. You've got to be able to understand where your enemy's weakest link is, concentrate your forces, and then punch through. So it's no difference when we think about warfighting for space and the importance of maneuver.
Your comment about it has to be done from an architecture perspective because there currently isn't a gas station in space. We've got to build that infrastructure if we want to leverage that infrastructure.
That's correct.
It just doesn't materialize. And so you've got to plan ahead and make a concerted effort as an architecture decision, not just as a one-off. So
that's correct. And that's also an area where I think that in the future, we may be able to start leveraging the commercial interest in that on-orbit maneuverability as well.
Yeah. And it's not just the physical infrastructure, but also the concepts of operation that need to be updated as well. If you're being refueled, you're probably out of mission, so who's going to back you up? And there's a lot to think through if we're going to fundamentally change the way we approach our architecture.
Right. All of these new space-based capabilities in every single mission area requires a certain amount of training infrastructure as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think John Saltzman says we need to be able to exercise sets and reps so that we're ready when we need to be ready.
Yeah, very good. Aiden, who's up next?
We have a written-in question from Peter Hart. He asks, Space Force leaders have increasingly discussed moving beyond single-orbit PNT solutions. General Garant has discussed the future systems involving multi-orbit phenomenologies that could include satellites in low Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, in addition to the traditional MEO orbits. How would this multi-orbit approach enhance resilience and the capability of the PNT architecture?
So any approach, and this goes back to my layered defense analogy, any approach which thickens the layers provides additional protection. In the future, we'll look at making sure that, for example, we're not designing our AntiJam solution to be optimized just in one orbit, in one waveform. We need diversity in terms of the spectrum to allow flexibility into the other orbits as well. And a lot of that can come through with these software-defined terminals that are being investigated across all the services.
Thank you. Aidan, I think we have time for one more question.
I think we have a follow-up question from Frank Wolf.
Go ahead, Frank.
Oh yeah, hi. Thanks again for taking my question. I was interested in sort of your comment on OCX being sort of the hardest program that you sort of worked on. And I understand as you sort of outlined there's some milestones coming up, and but I just wanted to check, as you probably know, there was this contractor responsibility watch list, which you're probably familiar with at the NRO, that the Air Force had kind of adopted. But I wondered if RTX was on the list for its performance on OCX, or whether, for example, one of the military GPS user equipment contractors, L3 Harris or BAE or RTX, was on the list for their performance on it, and just sort of what the way forward is to finally get, as you were talking about, sort of the ground side in the hands of the warfighter, which is kind of where the guys on the ground, which has been a difficulty over the years.
So I don't think we're going to identify anybody on the watch list at this forum, but can you talk about the importance of the watch list and how, as a PEO, you leverage that to ensure that we're able to move forward rapidly?
So the contract responsibility watch list was a provision provided in the NDAA that allows the Space Force just another tool for acquisition in order to provide oversight to a contractor who may be underperforming. And as Charles said, I can't share any perspective of who is or who isn't actually on a list.
But it is a useful tool as a PEO to help gain insight into where a contractor might be struggling.
And as Frank mentioned, it was implemented at the NRO, and when Mr. Calvelli was the SAE, he asked that all the PEOs understand how to implement that if we were to ever recommend it. He asked us to understand how to implement it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight today. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this Schriever Spacepower Series. Thank you again, Mr. DeLaPena, for taking the time to speak with us today. And from all of us at MI Space, have a great Space Power Day.
Thank you very much. Yep, thank you.
Great job.